We're going to continue our session, our meeting, by talking about human subject protections as professional standards. We've heard in meetings and public comment that at times there is tension that exists between the importance of regulation to keep human subjects safe and the burden that some researchers feel to meet them. And we recognize that regulations alone do not necessarily ensure or make for ethical practice. A researcher who embodies research ethics as a professional code will carry those ideals into the work, whether it's mandated as a condition of federal funding or simply a matter of moral propriety and rectitude. To get us started on this discussion, we're going to turn to John Aris. John will be representing one of the several study groups that we've had working, and this will be our pattern throughout the meeting, to let all the commissioners comment, hear from groups on which they may not have served, and to be able to comment on that. So John, when you're ready, I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. I'm on a committee with Steve Hauser and Alex Garza. Alex can't be with us today. So my charge here is just to get the ball rolling on some of the central points that we make in our section of the larger report. We can do this dialectically. I mean, we can begin with the doctors in Guatemala. Dr. Cutler, who viewed, I think it's fair to say, viewed the constraints of research ethics regarding informed consent and so forth as just so many obstacles to the kind of work that he was interested in doing. Wanted to keep his work secret, viewed surveillance by outsiders as interference by do-gooders, right? So he obviously viewed the norms of research ethics as obstacles to doing research. At the other extreme, we cite in our section here Henry Beecher, the famous whistleblower, who was sort of a transitional figure in the history of research ethics. Beecher was the great whistleblower, publishing an extremely important paper documenting the lack of informed consent. Beecher, however, was against the imposition of external law-like regulations to the process of research ethics. There's a wonderful line in one of Beecher's articles where he says, in addition to informed consent, really the best safeguard for the individual subject is what he calls the intelligent, informed, conscientious, compassionate, and responsible investigator. So Henry Beecher viewed really a kind of virtue ethic as the solution to the problem without the need for external regulation. Now, his hope for that sort of a regime was dashed in the years immediately after that, you know, with the revelations of Tuskegee and a host of other scandals, which proved the necessity of regulation. And that brings us to the common rule and the present day, where we have both a system of regulation and also, hopefully, a system of lively professional obligations sustained by professionals as part of their identity. So the worry is, and this is a worry that's been transmitted to the Commission on a number of occasions by people giving testimony, the worry is that the norms constituting research ethics are often today perceived as onerous obstacles to research. There's a kind of hyper-regulation. So there's a worry then that the norms are not being seen properly as a part of the professional identity of researchers. What it means to be a researcher would be to embrace these norms. So in our section, we advocate two different responses to this. Some clever person on the staff came up with interesting language of pruning and budding. Who's the gardener on the staff? So with regard to pruning, the idea is to prune away a lot of unnecessary or unnecessarily onerous regulations which it is alleged give the regulations a bad name. Ditto for certain kinds of training, which are perceived by various parties as being onerous. One of our testifiers called them insulting, right? So the pruning phase is to try to pare down the system so that the system will elicit more respect from those that it governs. The budding phase is a bit more amorphous. The budding phase really is a kind of open-ended encouragement to everybody who has a piece of this system to work together to find better ways to help professionals internalize these norms, right? Not just through regulation, but through collegial mentoring or other better ways to educate people. Finally, we have a much more discrete recommendation, which is that the common rule should address the actual responsibility of investigators. In other words, that the common rule should not simply address itself to the responsibilities of institutions, but also to investigators themselves. Some of the people around the table have been talking about what they've learned today, and this is something that this never struck me. I never really realized that the common rule was not actually addressed to individual researchers, but apparently it's not. So we advocate that the common rule does include a new section discussing professional obligations. So that's basically what we've come to, and we're really appreciative of any comments that you might have.
Remarks from around the group. Yes, Christine.
It's really a question.
Oh, may I ask everybody, although we can hear each other, it's really important to use the microphones close up so everybody in the back can hear us.
Okay.
Whether they want to or not. We're obligated to enable them to do so.
It's really a question, I think, John, you talked about it with respect to one of the pruning issues, and that is sort of making training programs more, I don't know what the right word is, palatable, less checklisty or something like that, less mind-numbing. And I'm wondering if we have any thoughts about how that should happen. You know, how do you internalize the norms? How do you teach people to internalize the norms?
Yeah, if I could just expand on that a little bit. I mean, I worked in a medical school for 15 years at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. And from my point of view, we're talking about the internalization of professional norms, and I saw how this was done, very close up. Mentoring, senior faculty mentoring junior faculty over a very long period of time. That's how it was done. Now, the problem that we have here is that we have huge numbers of researchers, huge numbers of research projects, and this kind of imparting of a spirit of professional responsibility has to be done on a massive scale. And that, I think, is the crux of the problem. We have huge numbers of people, and we have to think of ways to educate them that achieve the same results as the old-fashioned system, but in ways that might be more efficient.
So I wouldn't look back to any golden age where professionals internalize norms. I think what we're seeing here are two either complementary, which is what we'd like to make them, complementary, or conflicting ways of furthering professional ethics. And they are to have a set of robust rules that guide anyone who has the right and privilege to do research on human subjects, which we have a responsibility as a, society to enforce, and internalize norms of professional ethics without which it is almost impossible to have a set of rules and regulations. As much as the founding fathers wanted a constitution that would work even for devils, no constitution and no set of rules works even for devils. And nobody thinks that our professionals are devils, but even if they simply don't take ethics seriously, there can be problems, right? So we're trying to do both. And we have gotten to a point, we've heard from lots of people, that the rules and regs go beyond, I mean, they're so complicated and so they're not harmonized sufficiently to make any ethical professional think, oh, they're fine. So we have to prune, we have to advise, and that's what the ANPRM is trying to do.
Right.
Try to get more harmony so ethical professionals feel that they're being supported in their task and able to produce medicines and other really important products of ethical research. At the same time, and the question you asked, so I'm getting to my answer to this, is how do you get more internalization of professional standards? I think it is too late to wait until people become researchers and doctors. It's not that you shouldn't do it there, you should. But I think we need a more robust sense of the teaching of professional ethics at the undergraduate level to people who will not only become doctors, but people who will be affected by doctors in their life, so patients as well as doctors understand what the ethics of the profession is. And that's not something that the government can mandate, but it's something that we as a commission can say is sorely needed in our society, in our educational system.
Thanks for that plug. This is what we do at UVA.
We do it, and we need to, all colleges and universities, I think, need to do it more. But that's just a very, I think that frames what is, I think, an important recommendation, but that I think the recommendation is going to have to go beyond what can be done at the level of the professional researcher once that person is doing the research.
But it may
Actually,
not be for us to say it.
Nita's next, and then Lonnie.
So, Amy, I thank you for those comments because I agree with you. The more specific we can be with giving recommendations to how to do that and thinking at earlier phases, I think is quite helpful. We made a similar recommendation with synthetic biology about the internalization of norms. And I've been working with a group called the Human Practices Group of SINBRG, which is seeking to do just this, which is to develop norms for synthetic biology more generally. I think that's a laudable effort, which is really terrific that they're doing so, but they're struggling because they don't have, at first they are in later stages of development. They are postgrads, postdocs, people who are in later phases of their career, so they haven't had the earlier intervention. And they also don't have a lot of guidance. So they've been looking for outside guidance on how do you actually build norms that can be internalized and how do you do it within that field or in any field. And I think to the extent that we can brainstorm some more ways, including education at the undergraduate level, and provide ideas for researchers and ideas for, more generally, how we expect this recommendation to be achieved, I think that'd be incredibly helpful.
So let me give you one very specific recommendation, and there's a good body of evidence in, this is one of my fields in educational research, that this works. Our report on entitled Ethically Impossible, the report on Guatemala, could be made into teaching modules.
Yes.
And teaching case studies and what we as a commission have learned from those case studies, and we hope society, members of society will learn, we could make that so it's teachable at the high school level and at the college level.
Yeah.
And that's just one example. There are many other case studies that could be, developed as well. There is good evidence that when you engage students at every level, and this includes at the level of doctors and professionals, with actual cases where they have to say, what would I have done in this case? How can I understand what was done in this case? And how do I have to, act and think in cases like this? That works very well. And I think we can make a very specific recommendation that Ethically Impossible and other case studies actually be taught.
And absolutely, and it certainly helps in part ensure people know what to do. The real drill is to get them to do it. Lonnie.
One of my frustrations is in some of these things is that a lot of what commissions have proposed in the past and a lot of government convened groups have proposed never gets implemented. And I'm always looking on the lay side of, okay, how do we actually make this happen so that everything we do here is fruitful? And just to expand on what you said, Amy, you know, these modules you're talking about, I think it's the rubric that a lot of morality courses are taught, but it's still an elective. It's not something that is required for these children to take or for college students to take. And I don't even know maybe you can answer this, John, whether it is a required class or course in medical school. I'm not sure.
I think it is in medical school.
It's not required by the government, but most medical schools require a medical.
Well, because the profession
And our
requires
accrediting
it.
agency
The profession
requires
requires it, yeah.
But I mean, given the way, the way we operate here and trying to make these robust recommendations, I think it's important that we take that into consideration, that, you know, that it may not be an elective, it may be something that should be required of people who go through these institutions.
And it's so often done as a standalone adjunct as a part, instead of as part of the core. Raju?
John, thank you for all of the efforts so far. You know, we talked about, rules and regulations, and talked about the fact that the central theme of the importance of ethics is sort of hidden now by virtue of these larger numbers of rules and regulations. And I think that we should make that point very clear. The second aspect is that, is it sufficient for us to make a recommendation to say that we should prune the regulations, or do we need to be more specific about what are the specific areas in which pruning would be helpful? Because if we just say prune it, that may not have the same kind of impact unless we give specific examples of how things can be changed that would make people go back to the ethical principles and still be able to promote, the kind of clinical research that would be beneficial for humankind.
Could I just answer that on behalf of the larger project? I think Raju's absolutely right, and I think what we should say in professional standards is we ask for an exercise of pruning, and we'll give examples in the report of where we think there can be pruning. And so the examples will come, and I think one of the places that it can come in addressing Lonnie's very important concern, which is there are reports out there in the past on similar topics where we see no response. By which response I mean, Lonnie, not even a response of anything, right? I think now with the ANPRM exercise, there's an opportunity for us to be very specific about some places we think there should be pruning and how it should be pruned, because you can prune and something, to use this metaphor, something more vigorous can prosper, or you can prune and kill. And we don't want to kill important rules. We want them to actually be stronger as a result.
I think it's important, if and when we check in that way, that we be very clear of the purpose, John, that you said, to restore respect, and Raju, that you said, to reconnect the regulations to the ethical foundation. There is no dearth of a number of lists from other organizations also responding to the ANPRM, specifically on the onerous nature and redundant nature of some of these. And we can certainly look at some of those lists, including lists, a list produced by the AAU schools. And we may want to opine on those. But I think what the point we will need to make in that response is that we are focused on the ethic, as we are, and we're going to hear in the next session, that we're focused on the ethical dimension and not just the burdensome dimension, which is what most of the others are responding on, right? A burden of cost and effort. And we're responding on the connection to the ethical foundation. Steve.
One of the words that I most like in our report is lively. How do we institutionalize a lively culture of ethical thinking around the hospital and all of our professional organizations? And I was very taken by Gawande's argument in the New Yorker this fall about the importance of coaching for even very senior people. And I wonder if the educational standard that we require for our trainees might also be incorporated for the gray hairs in our professions. How can we stimulate an ongoing ground level continuous discussion through seminars, through special sessions that would focus on detailed questions that might not reach the IRB level?
That's a fair question. Dan?
On the budding side of things, one place that we can
use the
I'm sorry,
microphone,
bring it up.
please. Thank you.
On the budding side, one place where we can, I think, have some leverage would be to work with accrediting bodies, like for instance, not all the government that requires this. If you want to get into educational systems, the Liaison Committee on Medical Education has standards for medical schools. To the best of my knowledge, the education in ethics does not require anything on human subjects research ethics. Yeah. There's an exposure to research, but I don't think there's anything about research ethics. So that might be a place to move, and similar kinds of organization, because we're not just talking about medical schools here, as we know from our landscape project. So that might be a place to go.
That's a great
Second, in terms of working with the kinds of strategies we have, I don't know who we should engage, but I think some sort of systematic study of best practices for research ethics education, so that then it could be disseminated, would be extremely valuable. We can all sort of anecdotally say what we've had. What we do know is that pamphlets, however nice they are, don't work. And online courses actually, as we've heard from testimony, undermine the sort of sense of ethical responsibility and make it onerous, or can anyway, make it onerous for a lot of people. So we've got to find what the practices are, and I don't know that we are going to, in our little 40 minutes talking here together, find that, but we could figure out who to direct to conduct such a best practices study. I think that would be very valuable.
By the way, if anyone in our audience here who are participants has a question or a comment, please, the same holds with cards. Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Christine?
Just a little suggestion along the lines of what Steve brought up. There is a model that's developing. I think it started primarily, or got a lot of encouragement through what's called the CTSA, which is an NIH-funded network of institutions. And institutions that hold awards through the CTSA program are developing research ethics consultation services of various sorts. I mean, there are no standards, there's no one model at the moment. But I think the way most of them work, at least my familiarity with them, is exactly what you were describing. It's an opportunity for investigators and others, IRBs sometimes call for help, to have a discussion about what the difficult issues are that are not, formulated in the regulations, but come up in so many research projects. And so maybe some kind of, recognizing that kind of a model as one way to allow for these lively conversations and discussions would be something that we could do as well.
Good idea. Wonderful. Raj?
So I think Christine has made a point yesterday in a different forum, and she said that all of the people who are engaged or would engage in clinical research should be thinking about the ethical values right from the beginning, not at initiation of a trial or some other time, but right from the beginning. And that's a great idea. And one thing, at least I don't know about other institutions, that here, for example, we teach all of the graduate students, and the title is Responsible Conduct of Research. And it should be Ethical Conduct of Research. Because the responsible conduct research is a subset of
Yes.
ethical principles.
Yes. Yes.
So I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we do not emphasize ethics enough. The word ethics, not enough. I mean, they may be embedded in what you're trying to teach them, but if they think about that this is an ethical conduct, that might actually be very beneficial.
Excellent.
Good point.
Excellent, excellent. Well, good conversation. I think we had some input on both facets.
Thank you, yeah.
Pruning and budding, for you and Steve and Alex to work on. Oh, I'm sorry, did we have a comment from the?
Okay. Why don't you, well, this is a segue, but we'll segue with a comment.
Yeah, since we have someone.
You can just ask.
Stephen Marks?
He can.
Stephen, I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
Given the length and compression of your handwriting, would you mind coming, just
Stand up, yeah.
stand up and
And turn around and address the,
I can read it from,
oh,
okay,
if you can read it, that's terrific.
good,
I tried to condense it as much as I could.
Good,
Thanks a
good.
lot. Thank you, thank you. This relates to some of your previous work and previous reports that, regarding the standards that you're applying. And the way I put it was this: universally recognized human rights, in quotes, because that's directly from your report, are used by the Commission only to exclude some cultural practices from vitiating informed consent. That's the only place I could find the use of universally recognized human rights. And yet, informed consent, freedom of scientific inquiry, social justice, and a number of other ethical principles mentioned in your reports and in the discussion today are also universally recognized human rights that are also treaty obligations of the United States. Why does the Commission not refer to human rights standards binding not only on other countries, which you do refer to, but also binding on the United States? Are not human rights relevant to the, quote, harmonization of transnational standards and universal principles, which is part of your mandate?
So I'll begin.
Thank you.
And it is not out of disrespect for human rights standards that we don't mention that term more often. Rather, we think it helpful, given that there isn't a authoritative statement of human rights, but many statements, we thought as a commission it was most helpful to enumerate the ethical principles that we believe, and in harmony with human rights standards, we believe should govern the ethical conduct of research. And so we set a set of principles which is in harmony, we're happy to say, with the Belmont Report, for example, but goes beyond it, including public beneficence. You know them, they're in our report, but there are a set of ethical principles that are also in complete harmony with human rights standards. There are different languages that you can use. As somebody who is trained in moral and political philosophy, I'm well aware that depending on what theory of justice you defend, there's a different set of languages that you can use for this. But by and large, not entirely, but by and large, they are consistent. And certainly with there's everything we say in our previous reports is consistent with standards of human rights.
Sorry, I was referring to a treaty obligation of the United States, a legally binding treaty obligation of the United States, referring explicitly to informed consent, Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as you know.
Yes, but we...
More than just a choice of...
No. What I said, I'll just elaborate then on what I said. We defend informed consent as an important standard, ethical standard of research, and we have not and we will not retreat from that.
I'm not going to let you segue just yet because we've got another great question.
We're
I'm sorry.
this
is from a
okay.
student, actually, Ilana
Yes.
Yurkovitz. She writes, I'm a first-year, I'm a first-year medical student, so the topic of ethics education resonates closely to me. Many schools, including Harvard, now require ethics courses for medical students, but disappointingly, many students see these courses as soft or fluff and do not take the course as seriously as they should. And do we have thoughts on combating this attitude issue? We also have investigators. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, I'll provide you an anecdote that might have that relief. I mean, I had 1 hour of ethical training during 7 years at Stanford. So yeah, exactly.
But that was in the 19th century,
That was,
right?
yeah, it was in the Pleistocene
Wheel
era.
had just been invented, right?
But being a member of the Army, we, of course, we love to train and train to standard. And sexual harassment training is something that we used to do in the military once a year. Now I do it 4 times a year. And I will tell you that I've gone through a number of different modules every year. There seems to be something different. And it tends to be formulaic, and it tends to be something that, just like the student mentioned, a lot of soldiers don't take very seriously, just because of the way it's delivered. It's delivered by some board sergeant to usually a board group of soldiers, and they realize it's something they just have to do. So for the first time, about 3 months ago, I took an online module that actually was based on, and Amy, you're going to love this, it was based on cases. And so you chose who you're going to be. I chose myself to be, I think, a female sergeant. And you were given a series of videos, and based on what your answers would be, like what you should do next, what was the right thing to do as an observer or as that person, you would follow down a series of different pathways. And I found that, and again, I'm just doing this 4 times a year. It was the first time I really, I think, struggled with that topic and found it enormously helpful. So I think the more interactive training can be, especially when it's something you have to do and people don't take all that seriously, I think there are effective ways to make that cogent, and in my view, an interaction and case-based learning I found very effective.
Yeah,
You know,
we
you're gonna have-
really need to segue. Otherwise, we're not going to have
The
time.
boss says we're segueing. So.
Yeah, yeah.